I don't say things like this easily. I've learned that words carry weight, real weight, and if you throw them around, they lose their meaning. So when I say this message is for one woman, I mean it. Not the world, not a crowd, just her. She probably doesn't know the effect she has. That's the thing about people who are truly remarkable. They rarely do. They just exist, and somehow everything around them becomes a little more worth paying attention to. I'm not here to perform. I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm here because there's something that needed to be said, and it could only be said to her. She doesn't know what she does to the world around her. There is something almost unfair about the way certain people move through life, completely unaware of the gravity they carry. Not the loud kind of gravity, not the kind that announces itself, that demands attention, that fills a room with noise and performance. I mean the quiet kind. The kind that pulls at everything around it without even trying. The kind that makes the air feel different when she walks in. Not because anything visibly changed, but because something did, something underneath, something that doesn't have a name yet in any language I've come across. She walks in and the room doesn't erupt. It settles, like everything was slightly off before she arrived and nobody noticed until suddenly it wasn't anymore. I have been around enough people in my life to know the difference between someone who tries to have that effect and someone who simply has it. There is no effort in her. There is no calculation. She isn't arranging herself for anyone's benefit. She isn't measuring the temperature of the room and adjusting accordingly. She just exists fully and without apology. And that in itself is one of the rarest things I have ever witnessed. Most people, and I include myself in this, are performing in some way at some level. Almost all of the time, we are adjusting our voices, our postures, our expressions, the words we choose, the silences we allow. We are always slightly managing the version of ourselves that the world receives. And then there are people like her who somehow never got that memo, or got it and quietly set it aside and just decided to be real instead. Fully, uncomplicatedly, disarmingly real. And the thing is, she doesn't see it. That's what I keep coming back to. That's the part that stays with me long after I've tried to move my thoughts elsewhere. She genuinely does not see what she does. She doesn't see how people's eyes find her in a crowd without meaning to. She doesn't see how conversations shift slightly when she enters them, how the people around her unconsciously straighten something in themselves, not out of intimidation but out of a kind of involuntary respect. She doesn't see how the energy of a place changes, softens maybe, or sharpens depending on what the moment needs simply because she is now part of it. She doesn't notice any of this, and somehow that is the most powerful part of all of it, because what she carries isn't manufactured, it isn't a strategy, it isn't a brand, it is just her, unfiltered and unintentional. It lands like light on water. It lands on everything around her like light lands on water, without effort, without agenda, and with a kind of beauty that doesn't care whether anyone is watching. I've tried to understand it. I've sat with it long enough to know that understanding it fully might not be possible, and I've made a kind of peace with that. Some things resist explanation, not because they are complicated, but because they exist in a register that language wasn't designed to reach. She is one of those things, not in a way that makes her unreachable or mythological. She is deeply human, which is actually the whole point, but in a way that reminds you that human is so much more than we usually give it credit for. We reduce people, we summarize them, we fit them into the categories we already have because it's easier that way, because the mind likes efficiency, because the world moves fast. And we've all gotten very good at skimming. And then someone like her comes along and skimming becomes impossible. You can't skim her. You can't reduce her to a label. You can't reduce her to a sentence or a label or a convenient box. She keeps expanding the longer you pay attention. And paying attention is the only response she seems to deserve. I think about the small things. I think about them more than the large ones, actually, because the small things are where the truth lies. The way she listens, not the polite waiting for my turn kind of listening, but the real kind. The kind where you can feel that your words are actually landing somewhere, that they are being received and considered and honored. The way she responds to things that others brush past. The details that most people's eyes slide over without registering. The quiet moments inside louder ones. She catches them, she notices. And there is something in that noticing that makes the world feel less lonely. Even when nothing dramatic has happened, even when the moment is small and ordinary and would mean nothing to anyone keeping score, she has the ability to make the ordinary feel like it matters. And I don't think she knows she's doing it. I genuinely don't think it occurs to her that this is a gift. To her, it is simply attention, simply presence, simply being where she is with the whole of herself, rather than some curated fraction of it. And the effect of that ripples. That's the thing about her that I've turned over in my mind more times than I can count. The effect ripples outward in ways she never sees. The person she smiled at on a difficult day who carried that with them for hours afterward. The conversation she had that seemed casual to her but rearranged something quiet and important in the other person. The way she made someone feel seen without even trying to, without even knowing that was what the moment required. She leaves traces of herself in people without realizing it. Gentle impressions, small recalibrations of how someone sees themselves or the day or the world. She is changing things constantly, affecting the atmosphere of lives that intersect with hers. And she moves through all of it without a single spreadsheet, without a single strategy. She moves without a single conscious attempt to matter. She just matters effortlessly, inevitably, completely. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being someone who observes carefully, from being someone who pays attention, who watches the way things actually are, rather than the way they're presented. The world offers you a lot of surfaces and not always a lot of depth. And when you're wired to look for depth, the surfaces start to feel thin after a while. They start to feel like not quite enough. And then something real comes along and the contrast is almost startling. She is real in a way that the world doesn't always reward or even recognize because the world is often more comfortable with performance than with authenticity, more at ease with the polished version than the true one. She is the true one. She is so completely the true one that spending time in her presence or even at the edges of it recalibrates something, reminds you what you were actually looking for, reminds you what substance feels like. I don't romanticize people. I made a decision somewhere along the way not to, because romanticizing people is a way of not actually seeing them, a way of replacing the real person with a projection of what you need them to be. And I don't want to do that to her. I want to see her, actually see her, which means seeing all of it, the whole complicated human architecture of her, not just the parts that are easy or beautiful or convenient. But here is what I can tell you. After actually paying attention, after looking without the filter of what I hope to find, she is more than the version I would have invented. The real her exceeds the imagined one. And that almost never happens. That is almost never the case. Usually, reality disappoints the dream. With her, reality outpaces it quietly and without fanfare in the way that only true things can. She doesn't know what she does to the world around her. She doesn't know the weight she carries or the light she casts or the way her presence reshapes the emotional landscape of every room. She doesn't know how many small moments she has improved simply by being in them, how many people have walked away from brief encounters with her carrying something they didn't have before, some small warmth, some restoration, some quiet reminder that people can be good and real and worth paying attention to. She doesn't know any of this, and maybe that's the point. Maybe the not knowing is part of what makes it real, because the moment you become aware of your own light and start to manage it, something in it changes. Something dims slightly or bends or becomes about the awareness rather than the thing itself. She hasn't done that. She is still just her, still just being, still moving through the world the way she always has, completely unaware that she is one of the most affecting presences in it. And I don't know what to do with that except to say it somewhere, somehow, in whatever form it can take. I needed it to exist outside of me. This recognition, this witnessing of what she is and what she does. I needed this recognition of what she does and how completely she does it without knowing. Not because saying it changes anything, not because she will read this and suddenly understand the full scope of her own effect, but because some truths feel irresponsible to keep entirely to yourself, because some things deserve to be said plainly and without decoration, not for any outcome or any answer, but simply because they are true, and truth has a weight of its own that wants to be acknowledged. She doesn't know what she does to the world around her, and I do. And I have held that quietly for long enough that it needed somewhere to go. I have been watching life carefully, and she is the only thing that made sense. I have never been someone who moves through the world quickly, not in the way that matters, not in the way of actually absorbing it, actually letting it land, actually sitting with what is in front of me long enough to understand what it is asking. I have always been slow in that particular way, the way of stillness. The way that looks like stillness from the outside, but is actually a kind of constant, quiet examination of everything that passes through the frame of a life. I watch. I have always watched. Not out of detachment, not out of some cultivated distance from the human experience, but out of a deep and genuine need to understand what things actually are beneath what they appear to be. The world offers itself to you in layers, and most of the time the first layer is the least interesting one. I learned that early. I learned to wait for the second layer, the third, the one underneath all the presentation and the noise and the performance that living in the world requires of everyone. I learned to be patient with things, to not rush my conclusions, to give reality the time it needs to reveal itself honestly. And after all of that watching, after all of that careful, sustained, unhurried attention to the way things are, she is the thing that makes the most sense. Not the easiest sense, but the deep kind, the kind that stays. The kind of sense that settles into the bones and stays there. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say that, because it would be easy to hear it as something simple, something hard and uncomplicated. And it is not that. It has never been that. When I say she makes sense, I don't mean she is easy to understand. I don't mean she fits neatly into the framework I had already built for the world. In fact, the opposite is closer to the truth. She disrupts frameworks quietly and without intention, simply by being what she is, in a world that keeps insisting on being something less. What I mean is something more fundamental than understanding. I mean recognition, the specific and almost physical sensation of encountering something that your whole interior has been oriented toward without your conscious knowledge. Something your attention kept reaching for without being able to name what it was looking for. That is what she is. Not an answer I was searching for, because I wasn't searching in any directed way. But she is an answer, nonetheless, to questions I had been carrying so long I had stopped recognizing them as questions and had started accepting them as simply the texture of being alive. Life, in my experience, is full of things that almost make sense. That is one of its defining qualities. I think the almost is everywhere. The relationship that contains the right ingredients but somehow produces the wrong result. The moment that has everything it needs to be meaningful but remains stubbornly at the surface. The connection that promises depth and then reveals itself to be more interested in its own reflection. The almost is everywhere. And for someone who watches carefully, who waits for the real thing rather than settling for the convincing imitation, the almost accumulates. It builds up slowly the way sediment builds layer by layer, until you are carrying a significant weight of accumulated almost, without ever having made a single dramatic decision to do so. I know that weight. I have carried it. I have carried it through enough of my life to recognize its specific character, the way it sits just below hope, the way it is heavy without being crushing, the way it makes you careful without making you closed. And then she arrived, not with an announcement, not with any fanfare that would have allowed me to prepare, and the almost began to feel like it had been preparation rather than disappointment, like all of it had been necessary distance from something that actually deserved the wait. I have watched people love each other in ways that frightened me, not because of their intensity, but because of their blindness. The way love can operate as a kind of willed ignorance, a collective agreement to stop seeing clearly in exchange for the comfort of the story. I have watched people build entire lives on foundations they chose not to examine, because examining them would have required a courage that the momentum of living doesn't always leave room for. I have watched people mistake comfort for truth. I have watched people mistake familiarity for depth and comfort for truth, and the absence of conflict for the presence of peace. I have watched all of this carefully and without judgment, because I understand the human need for warmth even when warmth requires some compromise with honesty, and I have never been interested in the kind of purity that requires you to stand apart from what it means to be human and imperfect and in need. But I have also known in the quietest and most private part of myself that I was not capable of that particular compromise, that I would rather carry the weight of the almost indefinitely than build something on a foundation I couldn't fully trust, not because I am better, but because I am in this specific way less flexible, because the watching never stops, and if what you're watching is something real, it can survive the watching. But if it isn't, it cannot. She survives the watching. That is perhaps the most precise thing I can say about her. She survives it not just intact, but enlarged. The closer the attention, the more there is to find. The longer the looking, the more clearly she comes into focus. And what comes into focus is not a managed presentation, not a careful curation of the most flattering angles, but the full, unedited, genuinely complex reality of a person who has lived honestly and carries that honesty in everything she does. Most things do not survive sustained attention. Most things reveal their limits when you look long enough and closely enough, when the novelty fades and what remains is what was always actually there. She has no such limit that I have been able to find, and I have been looking, not in the suspicious, guarded way of someone waiting to be disappointed, but in the open and genuine way of someone who needs to know whether what they're seeing is real. Because real is the only thing that has ever been enough. There is a particular quality to clarity when it finally arrives after a long time of not having it. It doesn't feel triumphant. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare or flood the system with anything that resembles elation, at least not immediately. It feels first like recognition, like the return of something familiar that you hadn't consciously known was missing, like a frequency you had been slightly off from for a long time, trying to tune into something you could almost hear, but not quite. And then suddenly, the signal is clean. And it is obvious that this is what you were always trying to find. And the obviousness of it is both a relief and a quiet astonishment. That is what she feels like in the context of a life that has been watching and waiting and holding itself honestly to a standard that the world doesn't always reward. She feels like the signal becoming clean, not the end of complexity. She contains more complexity than I could map in a lifetime. And I am not looking for the end of it, but the end of a particular kind of static, the kind that accumulates when you are surrounded by things. The kind that accumulates when you are surrounded by things that almost make sense, that promise more than they contain, that borrow the language of depth without possessing the actual thing. I have thought about what it means to watch life carefully and arrive at a single truth. That truth is her.